Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Dreamer podcast for today. I have three stories, but the first one that I'm going to start with is interesting, and I'm going to play a long clip from it, like a 4-minute clip, because I assume that Rumble and Glenn Greenwald won't care. So for those of you guys who don't know, Glenn Greenwald is a journalist. I believe he's one of the best journalists in the world. He leans a little bit left, and he's one of those honest journalists left that will question both sides and really do a good job. So he did some sort of deal with Rumble. So this full video is at Rumble. It's not a paid ad or anything. I'm just trying to support the movement of that and him, since that's where the show's from. Let's watch him question RFK Jr. because what happened was RFK Jr. praised Roger Waters, and then he deleted the tweet because people were misconstruing his stance on Israel. And I think Glenn Greenwald asked some of the best questions I've seen. So let's play the clip without further ado, and then I'll react to it. Here it is. It's a long one, so hope you guys enjoy.
Let me ask you about a recent controversy in which you found yourself, more as a window to understand some of your broader views, which was the praise you originally offered for Roger Waters with regard to his stance on both Ukraine, which he is opposed to in terms of the U.S. proxy war, as well as COVID. He was questioning a lot of the same orthodoxies you were, and then you ended up deleting that tweet where you praised him and made clear that the reason was because he had held views on Israel and Palestine that you didn't share. I want to ask you about the specific kind of divergencies that you have with him on that question. But before I get into that, why was it necessary for you to delete your praise for Roger Waters just because you disagree with him on Israel? Can't you praise him on Ukraine and COVID and then at the same time say, but there are other issues, including Israel, where I have differences? Why did you delete the praise entirely?
Well, first of all, the reasons that I praised him was because of his position on the war, his position on COVID, which I thought was very courageous at a time when nobody, and also his position on Julian Assange.
Right.
I disagree, I would say fiercely, with his criticism of Israel. And I'm not, there are enough people who characterize those political differences anti-Semitic that me endorsing him felt like I was buying into that, into something that was abhorrent to me. I really disagree with I think Roger, like many critics of Israel, first of all, people who criticize Israeli policy should not be characterized as anti-Semitic. But people who apply a different standard to judging Israel than they would to judging an Arab country, I think then that you've crossed a line there. And I do think that Roger does that. I've now looked at some of his stuff, and I think, like I said, I do not think people who criticize that people who criticize Israel policies should not be called anti-Semitic. But I do think that many people are applying, who are Israel's critics, are applying a double standard.
So just to be clear, when you were interviewed by Crystal Ball on Breaking Points, it became kind of a very talked about interview, particularly the part where she was disagreeing with you about your view on vaccines. We did a segment on this show talking about that interview, and my main critique with her, she's a friend of mine, was that I didn't have a problem with her disagreeing with your views on vaccines. Lots of people do. She described it, though, as a red line, which seemed to me her way of saying, I don't disagree with you here, but you're so far beyond the pale about an issue that I regard as so sacred that the fact that that I disagree with you here means you're basically off limits, like you're radioactive, you're not susceptible to consideration for support no matter what, in a way that, say, Joe Biden wouldn't be. That's the impression I got when you didn't just disagree with Roger Waters on Israel, but deleted the praise, namely, doesn't matter how much I agree with him, I regard him as a person who's so radioactive that he should never be praised under any circumstances because of his view on Israel. That's a red line for me. Is that essentially what motivated your deletion in how you view people like Roger Waters and those who share his views on Israel?
No, not at all. In fact, I continue to admire Roger Waters for his positions on, for his courageous positions on the Ukraine, on Julian Assange, on COVID. But, my because of that issue is so sensitive and radioactive to people, I did not want to leave any opportunity for people to misunderstand. Since apparently, I guess, as I understand it now, he's more well known for his anti-Israel position than probably any other position. And so me praising him without making really clear what I was praising him for, and that I did not buy into his other stuff, was a source of confusion to people that I did not want to leave up there.
Fair enough. I mean, I think the reason why he's most known for that is sometimes the same reason you're most known for your views on vaccines, even though you have views on lots of other things, which is because a lot of times people look for ways to take establishment critics and kind of render them radioactive by focusing on the one issue they know people will be.
So I have a few thoughts on that. Just to wrap up what happened, he was praising Roger Waters. He tried to specify, I like what Roger Waters did on COVID and Ukraine, but a lot of people gave a lot of backlash because Roger Waters is known as a critic of Israel. He talks about, I guess what's going on in Palestine. And I would say Roger Waters is on the side of Palestine and he thinks Israel's doing a lot of messed up stuff. So RFK felt the backlash from that everybody thought he was praising Roger Waters for that, and he deleted his tweet. First off, I want to say anyone can delete what they want. I delete tweets sometimes, and people are like, why did you delete that? I don't know. I just didn't want it. I felt that I could have said it better and worded it better. It sounds like that's what RFK was saying, so I feel him on that. But I will say this. I do think that Glenn asked him the perfect question. RFK does a lot of things. He talks about vaccines and liability. He talks about the food supply, Monsanto. He talks about wars, but he's well known for vaccines, not because it's the only thing he does, but because it's the most controversial thing he does. So they call him an anti-vaxxer, and they try to basically blacklist him and say, if you agree with RFK, or if you like him, or if you like him as a person, then you're an anti-vaxxer, you're a conspiracy theorist. So they do the same thing to RFK Jr. That's why I thought it was a great question that Glenn had. We understand that you disagree with his policy and you want to make it well known, but do you want people to do that with you? Does RFK Jr. want people to say, well, I agree with RFK on Monsanto. I agree with RFK on, some big pharma things. I agree with RFK on building a wall in Ukraine, but because he's such a toxic figure, since he's so smeared by the media and it's just too dangerous to ever agree with him, I'm just going to never praise him publicly because it's too damaging to my reputation. These are the things that we go out of our way to show love to him. And it seems like he's a little nervous to do that to Roger Waters, but I understand also where he's coming from, that he vehemently disagrees on that. With that being said, he mentioned something else in that interview. He said, I think that you should, and this is one of the speech rules that's being passed through legislation by Donald Trump via executive order in 2019. Ron DeSantis passed it through legislation. He signed a bill in 2019, and he also recently signed a bill that makes it a trumped up charge if you're passing out flyers, etc., and littering on someone's property. If you read these actual legislation that Trump and DeSantis passed, by the way, they have like 15 or 20 rules. They've expanded the definition of anti-Semitism from what people think it is to a whole list of things. There's now hate speech that is, part of what that word means. And one of the things is exactly what RFK said is, you shouldn't criticize Israel as much as you criticize other Arab nations or even democratic nations. I think that's how it's worded in the law. But RFK said it similar. You shouldn't criticize them more than you criticize Arab nations. On one hand, as a fair person, I try to be fair with whatever I do. I don't try to look at one group of people, one religion, one race, or one country and say, oh, I'm going to hate on them more than others. I understand that people do that. But here's my thought process on that, trying to say that is anti-Semitism. That's basically what RFK said. If you do that, then you're anti-Semitic, but not if you criticize Israel equally to how you criticize others. Although I understand where he's coming from and where people are coming from, you have to understand this idea when it comes to that. If you criticize Ukraine more than you criticize Italy, that doesn't mean you hate Ukraine more than Italy. It doesn't mean you hate Ukrainians. It doesn't mean you're anti-Euchrometic or whatever, you make up a word. It just means that, one, maybe you are a nasty person, but there's other possibilities there. It doesn't necessarily mean that you hate Ukrainians. It just means that on a scale of Europe, you feel like they're doing more corruption. Maybe they're doing something that you don't agree with. I don't believe that it makes you a hateful person or it should be considered hate speech if you decide to criticize one nation more than the other. Yes, that's a possibility, but for RFK to join the ranks of DeSantis, Trump, and to be honest, almost everybody in politics with this broad definition of what it means to be a hate speech towards that thing, it's not necessarily true. You have to understand, I don't know much about, obviously I know what I've seen, but I've never been there. I've heard both sides of the story, and I'm not saying this to be a fence sitter. I just genuinely don't feel inspired to make this my thing because I don't have a huge stance on it based on what I know. I've heard both sides. I get the gist of it. But when I've heard Roger Waters talk about Israel and Palestine, I listened to his Joe Rogan podcast. They hated it. You know, they call him like the anti-Semite of the year or whatever. To me, it sounds like he's definitely taking the side of Palestine over Israel, but he has a reason for it. And I'm not saying you have to say what he's saying is true. If you live in Israel and you disagree, or you love Israel more than Palestine, I'm not telling you have to agree with Roger Waters. I don't even know if I do because I've never been there. I'm taking his word. I'm taking their word. I'm just honest. I don't know. I'm just hearing people's opinions on it. But what I'm saying is he doesn't look at Israel and say, I hate the Israelis, I hate the Jews, I hate these people, and this is why I feel that this way I feel. That's not what Roger Waters is doing on the Joe Rogan podcast. He's saying, this is what I experienced, this is what I heard, and this is why I think that they're mistreating these people and they have lopsided laws that, you know, oppresses the Palestinians. That's his ruling. Do you have to agree with it? No. Do you have to think it's right? No, I have no idea. But to suggest like RFK is to back away and say, well, since he's so toxic in that topic, I don't want to really, you know, confuse people and compliment him. I get what he's saying, but at the same time, I do not agree that just because you criticize them more than another country necessarily means you hate them and hate everyone. If they're doing lockdowns and vaccine mandates more than other Arab countries, does that mean I hate them if I disagree with their government or their policy? Or does it mean that you hate everybody if you know that there's a lobby in America that, you know, spends a lot of money and resources to get Americans close to Israel because that's one of the biggest places we give foreign aid? There's a multi-billion-dollar, you know, thing going on there. You could take that side or you could take that side. The point of what I'm making, I hope it's clear because it constantly gets misconstrued and I constantly get called an anti-Semite by every side, even though I'm not. I've never been hateful. I've never even really critiqued Israel that much more than their government and their policies of what they did to their own people, etc. I critique US politicians more than I critique them because it's our politicians' responsibilities to look out for our country. And it's Israel's politicians' responsibility to look out for their country. I don't complain about their politicians. I complain about our politicians and the fact that they don't have our best interests. So to make a long story short and sum this up, I have to be completely fair. I understand what RFK is saying. He wanted to be completely clear, but I completely disagree with his idea that that means necessarily that you hate them. And I was listening to the full interview. It sounds like RFK is exactly like Trump, is exactly like DeSantis, is exactly like Biden, and is exactly like the Republican Party on this topic. He's not willing to really critically think and say truthful things. He's willing to take the most low-level, basic, you know, I will let you do this, but if you do this, then it must be hate speech and you must hate everybody. And that's not true. I spend more time criticizing America more than I criticize other nations like ours. Do I hate America? Does that mean I hate everyone here? Do I hate myself? No, I just think it makes sense to do that because I live here and I'm concerned about it. It doesn't mean I hate it necessarily. So yes, let's be honest. There are hateful people out there. There are nasty people out there. But when we use that word anti-Semitic like racist, it becomes one of these words that means nothing. They call everything racist. So now the word doesn't mean anything. They call everything sexist. And RFK is another Trump and DeSantis. He's not going to blow your mind on this topic. He's not going to speak these deep truths. He's going to play it as safe as possible because like everybody in Washington, they know the consequences of not doing that, which is why he is willing to talk about so many things, but he'll back away and be as safe as possible when he talks about that. And I think that Glenn Greenwald did the perfect question. We understand we're not saying you have to agree. But do you want people to treat you like that? Do you want people to be afraid to praise you? Do you want people to be afraid to attach their name to you and compliment you because some of the stuff you do is so looked down upon in the media? I don't think he wants that treatment for himself. So it's just something to consider. And I like a lot of things about RFK. I think he's super righteous in many categories. And I don't care necessarily that he disagrees with me on certain things. This is just my opinion and my perspective. And like I've always said, and this is probably the thing I get smeared for the most, misconstrued the most. I even have Trump supporters and conservatives that are calling me crazy smears that aren't true, simply because I talk about the lobby in Washington that influences politicians. It's just real, just like the big pharma lobby is real. But when I say that, people say I'm anti-Semitic. When I say that American politicians, this is the one topic they don't want to touch, people say I hate everybody, and they start using crazy terminology to talk about me. I've never once hated anybody. I've never once preached hate for a religion or a race or a group of people. I'm not even that involved in the Ukraine, or what I mean, not the Ukraine, what's it called? The Palestine, Israel. Like, I'm not somebody that's over here like Roger Waters laying out the case for Palestine. I don't know enough about it. If I flew over there and got to talk to both sides and see it, then maybe I would have a bigger opinion, but I'm going based off of what people say. So I don't really, I get the gist of it, but it's one of those things that, RFK, I can't say I'm disappointed because I never really have faith in these politicians anymore anyway, but I just find it very interesting. And I'm glad that Glenn Greenwald at least asked him a good question about it. And it's something to look at, because similar to how the Republicans locked down for a couple weeks and a few months and 15 days to slow the spread, and then the Democrats did it for 2 years, and then the Republicans threw their hand in the air and said, oh, we didn't do it as long. Yeah, but you opened the slippery slope. You allowed the slippery slope of communism and lockdowns and big pharma tyranny to seep into our country, and then we got bamboozled from it. So you're not the victim. If you care about free speech and the First Amendment, you have to look at the things that RFK is saying, that DeSantis is passing through law, and that, to be honest, Trump passes through law, and nobody really challenges it in Washington outside of 5 people. If you care about free speech and you don't believe in hate speech, you have to understand that RFK, DeSantis, and Trump are willing to exaggerate and expand the definition of what the word anti-Semitism means to start targeting people that have valid criticisms of government or policy. And just because you talk, I mean, I understand where they're coming from. I really do get it. But if you criticize Canada more than you criticize other countries, you might hate Canada. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you hate Canada. Maybe you're just passionate about that. I'm passionate about sports. Am I only allowed to talk about one sport more than the other? Everybody doesn't talk about everything. So if you dedicate your time talking about the Ukraine war, I'm never going to say that you hate Ukrainians because you spend so much time critiquing them. That might be true, but that also might not be true. So for RFK and DeSantis and Trump, for all to say, if you criticize them more than you criticize them, then that must mean you hate everybody. It's a total lie. And this is why the right is useless. They're the same snowflake, safe space liars that believe in hate speech when it's convenient to them and their career. And that's what Washington is, a bunch of phonies. And you just got to pick your favorite one. I like RFK. I like some things about Trump. I like some things about DeSantis, but this stuff doesn't even shock me anymore because I'm just going to assume at this point that nobody's really going to, go there or say that sort of stuff. And this isn't coming from hate, and this isn't coming from anger, and this isn't coming from blame. It's just the reality of how free speech works and how, news analysis and global analysis works. It doesn't mean you hate a country if you criticize them all the time. And it definitely doesn't mean you hate everybody that ever exists if you talk about reality of statistics or lobbying money. I always make the joke that, am I anti-pharmetic? Am I anti-pharmetic because I talk about the big pharma lobby? Of course not. So why in the world would I be called this 1,000 times, smeared by multiple organizations, smeared by conservatives, smeared by liberals? I get smeared by everybody more than anything I ever talk about for telling you what I just told you. So I hope you guys appreciate it. I appreciate you. I hope you appreciate me saying this, because they try to ruin my life on every level every time I try to tell you this stuff. Trust me, it's the number one thing that they hate the most, and that I get attacked from all sides for being honest and kind about. So that's what it is. I appreciate you. And I want to give a quick shout out real quick to this show on the Hill. I forget the name of it, but it's with Robbie Sloan and some girl, Brianna Joy Gray. They did a breakdown of that little bit and a little bit more into the debate between Glenn Greenwald and RFK Jr. And they did a very, very fair bipartisan piece on it, really pointing out the inconsistencies in RFK Jr. I'm not trying to hate on the guy. I'm just saying the Hill, that segment they did on the Glenn Greenwald RFK thing was great. And I love seeing other people do honest analysis. It's seems like they're doing good work over there. All right, I have 2 more stories, folks. Thanks for being here.